He signed the papers without looking at me. 47 years, and he couldn't look me in the eye. Those words still taste strange in my mouth. They're small, only a handful of syllables, but they carry 47 years of kitchen arguments and quiet apologies, of winters with a single coal stove, and summers with a yard full of children's bikes. They carry the sound of the front porch swing at dusk, and the smell of the lemon soap we used for everything. He pushed the stack of legal paper toward me like it was merely a form to be filed, and then he stood up and left the office, as if that was the end of a Tuesday, and not the end of a life we had built together. I am 72. My name is Claire. Our house has been on the same corner in Lakewood, Ohio since 1981, a tall Victorian with a porch that always needs scraping and an avocado green tile in the upstairs bathroom that I once swore I'd replace and never did. It has my husband's initials carved into a stair riser, where he hid a note to tell me he loved me during a thunderstorm. It has my children's scribbles under the attic insulation, and the impression of 100 small shoes in the mudroom. For 47 years when people said home, they meant that house. For 47 years when people said us, they thought of Robert and Claire as one. He left, for a woman less than half his age, for a yoga instructor he met at a community center. Her name is Amber. That's all either of us really needed to know at first. Amber, 28, who teaches morning classes and wears her hair in a knot. She is not a monster. She is a person with a life that doesn't include the home shelves that sag under the weight of photo albums. She is a catalyst. She is a rumor that turned into a life change. I am telling you this because I want you to know how sudden it felt. Not just the leaving, the dismissal, the way some people think divorce happens in chapters. An affair, a conversation, a decision, and then life rearranges itself neatly on the next page. It wasn't neat. It was full of small practicalities stacked on top of heartbreak. Keys changing hands, a trip to the bank, a solicitor's office smelling of coffee and cheap carpets. There was the practical wound of paperwork on my lap, and the emotional wound behind my ribs. Both bled. Before I go further, where are you watching from? Tell me your city and state in the comments. I want to know the geography of people who have sat in the air like me and thought, now what? We met in the summer of 1974. Young, somewhere between earnest and reckless. Robert had hair like a mane and a laugh that took up a room. I had pockets of fear and a newly minted degree in literature, which taught me to love sentences and to hold my tongue when they were better used for other things. We married in the city courthouse on an overcast Wednesday, and by the next spring, we had moved into a rental with rickety stairs and a view of a factory roof. Babies came. Jobs changed. We painted the nursery the wrong shade of blue twice because none of us could agree on what our lives should look like. When the kids were small, I took odd jobs so we could get by, typing for an attorney, substitute teaching, baking cakes on weekends. Robert worked steady hours at a machine shop, then at a manufacturing plant outside Cleveland. He liked to fix things. He had a toolbox he swore by, and his hands held the smell of machine oil even after a bath. Money never felt abundant, but it was consistent enough. We learned to live below our means because our dreams, if we had them, deferred until later. One day we'll travel, we would say, as if the line, one day, could be swapped for a date on a calendar. We bought the Victorian because a realtor said it had good bones. People still say that when they want to be kind about flaws. I loved the house for its bones and for the way the front windows caught the sun each morning. It was too big for 2 people when our children left, but I couldn't imagine it without the stairwell where their laughter echoed. Over the years we patched leaky roofs, repainted porches, and left fingers of our lives in the plaster. Home was a ledger of small sacrifices and shared jokes. It was a place that remembered us even when we forgot ourselves. So when the neighbor, Patricia, came across the yard one spring afternoon to tell me she'd seen Robert with a woman she thought was about half his age, my stomach dropped like a freight elevator. Patricia is the sort of neighbor who brings homemade marmalade and a look that says she will tell you plainly what she saw because she thinks you deserve to know. She sat on my porch, cup of tea in her hands, and the porch swing creaked under the weight of things that are too heavy to keep. "You don't want to be the last to know," she said. That was how she began. I wanted to be private. I wanted to trust the man I had shared 47 years with. But trust is not armor. It is paper. Patricia had seen the two of them leaving a yoga studio together. She had seen them at a cafe afterward. She had seen Robert look at that woman the way he used to look at me, before mortgage payments and vegetables and birthday candles eroded the novelty of each other's faces. I tried at first to rationalize. Men work with women who are younger. People meet. I called Robert's office and asked if he was okay. He was. He talked about a project. That should have satisfied me. It didn't. I checked our phone bill because in the old ways of discovery, paper can be a steady friend. Telephone numbers tell stories in their own quiet way. Times, dates, how often someone called, how late at night. There were gaps. There were calls late on a Tuesday and a Sunday afternoon when Robert said he was at the shop. There was a name I didn't know. The truth has a way of being both ugly and, at times, annoyingly mundane. I confronted him at the kitchen table. I set the bill between us like a mirror. He did not look at me. He did not deny it with violence or anger. He denied it with a certain casualness, an almost apologetic shrug that was worse than fury. "I deserve to feel alive," he said. That sentence I would later replay in my head like a hymn and like a warning. What it meant I still don't know exactly. What it did was place the blame squarely on the idea that what he wanted mattered more than what we had built. There are many expectations families hold: loyalty, reciprocity, respect. There are also quiet assumptions that the older partner, often the woman, will put her life on pause for the family and then pick it up again when the children leave. We all told ourselves that was a reasonable bargain. It's a bargain that, when the other party decides to renegotiate without discussion, leaves the remaining partner astonished and bereft. Our children, Sarah, Michael, and Jennifer, called like a chorus. They were in different states, miles and schedules apart, yet everything conspired to make them come together. Texts, FaceTime calls where the screen filled with their faces at once, voices that started with fury and melted into concern. "Mom, are you okay?" Sarah asked, voice tight. Michael, practical and blunt, started calculating things. Pensions, what the house might be worth, whether we could keep it. Jennifer offered to fly home and clean out the attic herself. They each had a different way of showing up, but they showed up. That mattered. You do not realize until you are in the middle of a private earthquake how much maps and schedules, kids, friends, neighbors, become scaffolding. I did the practical things as best I could. I called Marcus Chen, a divorce attorney my sister recommended, who had a calming voice and a reputation for being tenacious without being theatrical. Marcus sat in his office, hands folded, and listened. He had the patience of someone who had seen enough human sorrow to know how to wait before giving counsel. He told me plainly that there were options. There were choices about who kept what, their value often measured not by memory, but by market numbers and legal precedent. He explained retirement accounts and property division in a way that assumed neither ignorance nor naivete, which was a relief. He told me the one thing I needed to know most. Do not make decisions out of devastation. Make them from a place of information. You can take the retirement split, he said, or you can keep the house. If you keep the house, get it appraised first. He wanted me to see the house as more than a mausoleum of shared memories. He wanted me to see it as an asset. He didn't sugarcoat it. He said properties of that style in the Lakewood area had been underpriced in the past, but the market shifted in patterns. "I don't promise miracles," he said. "I promise we'll be pragmatic." That was what I needed. Someone telling me the possible routes without pretending to know what the right answer was for my heart. Accepting the house sounded at first like a defeat. It sounded like empty rooms and an echo. But it also sounded like control. When you give someone your last thing in a divorce, your home, you give up tangible territory. When you keep it, you keep the option of what to do next. Marcus stood with a map of choices. The house was a point on that map. An appraisal would anchor it to the market. Numbers would come. Numbers would either be a door or a wall. I remember standing on the back porch the day I signed the forms that allowed me to take ownership of the property. The porch smelled like the lemon soap and cut grass. A breeze moved through the wind chimes Robert had hung 30 years ago. I felt like an actor in a scene I had not written. I signed papers with shaking hands and then called my children. I told them the decision I'd made. There were tears and relief, and then there was the pragmatic question from Michael. "Who's the appraiser?" Thomas was recommended by Rebecca, the real estate agent my neighbor had used to sell a house down the street. He was in his 50s, wore a cardigan that matched his sensible shoes, and carried a clipboard like it was a shield against overstatement. He knocked on the front door, and we walked the house together. His eyes moved over the crown molding, the banister, the old plaster, the windows with their slightly warped leaded glass. He asked questions about when the roof was last done and whether the furnace had been serviced. He rapped his knuckles on a floorboard to test if it had been replaced in the last renovation. People who appraise houses learn to listen to them the way a doctor listens to a patient. "There's character here," he said. "Original woodwork, period glass, and those plaster medallions. That's not common." He didn't say, "This will make you rich," and for that I was grateful. He measured rooms in silence, making little marks on his pad. He found the kind of things that feel like secrets, a patch of wallpaper behind a closet door, with a color I had not seen in 20 years, tacked over hinges that suggested a former servant's staircase, a few original panes of glass with that kind of imperfection that only time gives. "We'll need to check comparable sales in the area," he told me. "Victorians in Lakewood have shown strength, but it's conditional. Location, condition, and timing. There's a buyer out there for this kind of heritage, but you have to present it well." He didn't use the word must in a way that made me feel rushed. He used it like someone balancing a ledger. Facts across one column, possibilities across another. That night I went through the house on my own. I walked through rooms like someone going through stages of grief. Denial in the kitchen where the sink still smelled like garlic. Anger in the study where Robert had a shelf of tools and better lighting than I'd ever had in my craft room. Bargaining in the laundry room where I thought of the times I might have done more to keep us together. And acceptance, oddly, in the attic, among boxes of things I had not looked at in years. I found an envelope with letters from when we were first married. His handwriting had been looser then, less careful. I read a line he'd written after a winter storm. "I promise to keep the light on if you promise to not waste it." In the shape of the ink, I recognized the person I had loved, and still loved in parts. What I did not find in that house was a guarantee. I found timber and plaster, and the smell of lemon soap. I found potential, and that was a strange kind of consolation. The days that followed the appraisal were a mix of ordinary chores and sudden decisions. I started calling people I had never thought to call. I called Luis Martinez, a contractor my neighbor recommended for a small deck repair, and, if I was honest, because he had a steady, calm manner and a name that felt like a towel thrown over a strange, wet morning. Luis is in his 40s, wears his hair short, and has a laugh you can't help returning. He came by with a partner, Maria, who brought practical ideas and an eye for color that made my avocado bathroom look, in an instant, less like regret and more like a design problem. "We can phase it," Louise said, sketching on the back of an envelope. "You don't have to gut the whole place at once. Start with structural, then cosmetic. We can do a paint palette that keeps the character." I nodded because the idea of doing it in phases, one small victory at a time, felt manageable. There was pride in the thought that I could still make decisions that mattered, that I could engage the world in work that was not only practical, but creative. People think renovation is a metaphor only in books, but there is a literalness to learning how to hold a sander without causing a hole in the wall, to choosing paint that looks like sunlight rather than a hospital corridor. There is also a privacy in dirty hands. They give you a reason to step out into the yard at 9 in the morning with work-gloved palms and a radio in the background. Once you start it, the work becomes a companion. It asks things of you that grief does not: competence, patience, a willingness to be modestly clumsy. My children visited. Sarah brought over soup and a notebook of things that needed doing. "Change the locks," she wrote in big letters. "Find out about property taxes," she wrote. "Call Rebecca about the listing," she suggested. Michael combed through old receipts and ledgers. Jennifer took endless photographs and labeled boxes with a care that looked like respect. They were part of the scaffolding I was building around myself, practical, loving, and not intrusive. There was also Patricia, who showed up with a cedar chest of quilts she had salvaged from her mother's attic, and a willingness to sit and talk about wallpaper patterns as if those small domestic worries could be a kind of balm. I found in surprising places a quiet energy. I found satisfaction in peeling back wallpaper to reveal a pattern older than I remembered. I discovered behind a wall in the dining room a section of stained glass panels that someone had boarded over in the 80s. It was not much, just a sliver of color hidden behind drywall, but it felt like a secret that had been waiting for me to pay attention. We unbolted the securing boards, and sunlight leaked through in a way that made the whole room look like a memory reassembled. I felt a small, fierce joy at the idea that the house had treasures hidden within it. It felt like a little proof that not everything about our years together had been wasted. Then the call came. Thomas said he'd finished his report and wanted to meet. I remember the way my hands went cold, how a room can feel both too big and too small at once. Numbers have a weight to them. They arrive and sit on your kitchen table like a decision with teeth. Marcus suggested we read it together at his office, which was a good idea. He said it would be less lonely that way. He poured coffee as if making room for a ritual, and when I read the pages with him, line after line of square footage, market comparables, notes about the woodwork, I felt the odd sensation that this was the first time I had been allowed to look at my life from another angle, as if my own history were being valued in someone else's ledger. Thomas's appraisal did not feel like a miracle. It felt instead like the sharpening of possibility into plan. The number he wrote down had commas in unfamiliar places. It was more than I expected. It was more than Marcus had suggested might be prudent to hope for. But it didn't make me reckless. It made me breathe. "That number changes things," Marcus said. Not in triumph, but in the voice of someone who measures outcomes and then lets you choose how to feel about them. I didn't have to sell the house. I could choose the house as my asset, but now choices opened like doors I had closed for decades. Selling could mean cash. Keeping could mean security and continuity. The appraisal had turned heartbreak into leverage. I felt the tilt of the world change under my feet in that moment. But leverage is not destiny. It is an opportunity. It demands decisions that are practical and, at times, painful. It demands that you reconcile the person you remember with the person you have become. It asks for courage in equal measure to planning. And just as the number lay on the paper, so did the question. What would I do with this house, now that its value was no longer only sentimental? We started in pieces of small, sensible work. Luis drew up a phased plan on a paper towel first. Foundation, roof, then wiring and plumbing, then the visible things. Kitchen, bathrooms, paint, floors. Phased meant I didn't have to empty my life like a house of its furniture in a single day. It meant I could pay as I went, keep my savings from being swallowed whole, and measure progress in boxes checked off, rather than in collapsing hopes. The first week was loud. Men with tool belts became part of the household's new furniture. Ladders leaned where the hall table used to be. Drop cloths hid the top of the dining room, and the sawdust settled into the corners like new citizens. Luis and Maria worked with the kind of focused cheer I'd forgotten to expect in strangers. They were careful with the old banister. They used felt pads and soft voices when they removed the plaster medallions for repair. They treated the house like something to be trusted back to me when the day was over. That mattered. I learned small, usable things. I learned how to choose a paint finish so it didn't fight with the light. Satin in the hallway, eggshell in the bedrooms. I learned that sanding is both patient and violent. Patient because it is repetition. Violent because it strips away layers until something honest is left. I learned to hold a hammer so my hand didn't bruise, how to ask a question and not feel ignorant for asking it. I learned how to call a supplier and insist politely that they not deliver lumber at the 1 hour I had booked the hospice nurse. Organization was a kind of dignity. There were days I wanted to shut the door and not answer the phone. Renovation is noisy in more ways than one. It forces you to face the small disappointments. The wrong tile, a delayed shipment, a subfloor that needed more work than the estimate allowed. But there were also honest, surprising pleasures. The first time we peeled back the layer of laminate on the kitchen floor and found original maple underneath. The wash of warmth as if the house was showing us a secret. We sanded carefully and finished it with a natural oil that made the wood look like it had always been meant to be walked on barefoot. Neighbors brought food. Patricia, who'd been my watchful, marmalade-bearing friend since I moved in, showed up with a thermos of soup and a folded list, names of people to call, who had spare paint, who could lend an extra ladder. She insisted on sitting in the chaos and telling stories about yard sales, where she had found brass doorknobs for $1. Her presence felt like continuity, an older life holding up a new one. Sometimes she'd bring a crocheted throw and say, gravely and with complete faith, "Put this on the sofa. It will make everything look more put together than you feel." It did. My children were involved in a practical, tender way. Michael took on the role of accountant and logistics manager. He spread papers on the kitchen island like a general planning a campaign. Sarah, more conversational, discussed staging and feng shui. She laughed at my avocado tile and suggested a tile with a modern nod that would respect the house's bones, but not mock my past. Jennifer took photographs and catalogued items with a care that made me feel less eccentric about keeping certain things. Sometimes, between the clatter of tools, we would have evenings where we sat on folding chairs on the porch with wine cooled in a bucket and watched the sun turn the Victorian trim rose gold. We would talk about small things, what to keep, what to sell, which pieces of furniture had a story worth saving. Those small domestic decisions felt like reconstructions of trust. We found more than flooring. Behind the drywall in the dining room, we'd already discovered a sliver of stained glass. Later, as they opened up the back staircase to check for rot, Luis found a hidden shelf with a tin of old buttons and a daybook from 1968 with faded appointments and a grocery list that mentioned peanut butter and gasoline. In the attic, under brittle boxes of holiday decorations, I found letters, loving, awkward notes from the early years, The kind of handwriting that presses harder when someone needs to make a point, and is otherwise a quiet person. I read them one afternoon with a cup of tea, and a sense that the man who had walked out was not a single-note villain. He was the author of a long chapter we had both co-written. That knowledge did not make what he did easier, but it made the whole thing more human, and therefore less like a stain I wanted to scrape away. Practical choices multiplied. We repaired the roof in 2 stages so I could get an insurance quote before committing to the full replacement. The electrician rewired second-floor outlets to bring them up to code. I learned about the importance of permits and that sometimes paperwork's tedium is what keeps the house safe. Money moved from one place to another in a careful choreography. Marcus watched the spreadsheets and reminded me not to be reckless. "You can spend on what matters," he said, "but make sure you keep an emergency cushion." He had that mix of legal caution and human empathy. He was a man who spoke in clauses when needed, but never let fear dictate all the planning. There were small humiliations. I mismeasured a doorway and ordered the wrong size radiator cover. I bought a pendant light that looked beautiful online and was much smaller in person. I learned to laugh at these things. Sometimes the only answer was to return a lamp and accept that imperfect choices are a kind of forward motion. There were also the quiet triumphs. The first night I cooked in the renovated kitchen, and the drawer that used to stick slid so smoothly, I looked at it like it had performed a miracle. The first time I had friends over to eat pancakes in the morning on the newly sanded floor, I felt proud without needing anyone to tell me why. When the kitchen looked like something a house could be proud to hold, Rebecca came to take photographs for the listing. She is brisk in the way of people who understand markets. She also has an eye that reads the house like a person. "We'll stage for heritage," she said. "Don't over-modernize. Buyers who come for this style want to feel connected." We took care with vignettes, a stack of linen napkins tied with twine, a tea set that looked as if it had been used an honest amount. Rebecca recommended a professional stager to soften the edges and suggested a color for the front hole that would photograph well in morning light. She set the listing for a weekend showing schedule and promised to use the prep time to line up comps, offline networks, and a list of interested buyers who liked that kind of reclaimed charm. There were moments of doubt. I asked myself, out loud at night sometimes, whether I was selling away my memory or transforming it. Would the house become a stranger's memory? I took solace in the fact that the house's value, whether sentimental or financial, had now become a tool I could use. The appraisal had opened a door. It was up to me how far I wanted to walk through. The listing went live in late spring. Lakewood's market, while different from coastal cities, had a healthy appetite for character houses. Young families who wanted something with history and proximity to the city. Empty nesters who wished to downsize but maintain a sense of aesthetic integrity. Rebecca held 2 open houses and sent out private invitations. We had a weekend of viewings that felt oddly intimate. People who paused by the stained glass and ran their fingers gently along the wainscoting. Couples who whispered about how they could repaint a room themselves. A young woman who exclaimed at the depth of the attic storage. Notes came in the following week. Offers came in the next. I remember the night I sat down with Marcus at the kitchen table, and we read them together like one reads a letter that might change everything. There were multiple offers. Not a bidding war in heady terms, but solid proposals that made sense. I had warned my children, and myself, not to expect fairy tales. I knew the market could change tomorrow. But standing at that table, seeing the numbers and the earnestness of the offers, I felt something close to vindication. Though I refused to frame it as revenge, it was stewardship paying off. It was the house's value affirmed by other people's willingness to make it theirs. We accepted an offer that was strong and sensible. The closing process was efficient but felt ceremonial. There were signatures and the exchange of keys. I walked through the rooms one last time with Luis and Maria, who had become more than contractors. They had become friends who knew the house's bones better than anyone. Maria pressed a hand to the stained glass and laughed, the way someone laughs when they have watched a secret become visible. "They will love this," she said. "You made it ready." I wanted to thank them properly, but words felt small, so I baked them a loaf of bread and watched them drive off with it wrapped in a tea towel. Robert came back after the sale. He arrived with a cautious smile and a set of reasons dressed as curiosities. "I heard the house sold," he said, as if he had not been present for the signing of divorce papers. He asked about the price, as if those commas on the page should be explained to him. I felt a familiar old ache and a new firmness rise together. He, who had not been willing to look at me when it mattered, was now curious about the numbers. "I appreciate you caring," I said. "But those days are over." I could have told him everything. The hours, the paperwork, the decisions made in the quiet. I could have harvested bitterness and offered it to him. But I didn't want to make the exchange about humiliation. I wanted it to be about boundaries. "I made choices that were right for me," I told him. He blinked and then he asked, like someone checking a ledger, "A share?" That was the moment I had practiced for, in smaller ways. I had the lawyer's advice, the papers, and my children's practical counsel. I said calmly, "No, the settlement is final." It was not cruelty. It was a protection. He shifted, searching for a retort that would place him back in control. There wasn't one that fit. He left, and I shut the door with the steady press of someone who has learned how to close chapters without tearing pages. After the closing, life softened in a particular way. There were fewer boxes to unpack, because I had already sent many things on to new owners at a neighborhood yard sale and via local consignment. I moved into a condo that was smaller, cleaner, and, to my surprise, liberating. It had a balcony that looked over a tree-lined street and a little kitchen that fit me perfectly. I bought furniture that was mine for the first time in peculiar ways. A small table that didn't remind me of a university roommate. A lamp that I chose for light rather than sentiment. It felt like shedding a costume and discovering the person who had been wearing it all along. Plans formed. Patricia and I booked flights to Italy, a week in Tuscany to eat and walk and look at light across olive trees. She and I had joked about a trip like that for years. It had been one of those mutual promises we made over tea and never scheduled. Now we had an itinerary. Florence, then a drive along a road that promises the kind of quiet you can only get when you are no longer trying to be anyone but yourself. Sarah offered to come and cat-sit if needed. Michael insisted on making sure my travel documents were in order. Jennifer, with her steady camera eye, offered to put together a travel album when I returned. I didn't sign up for a life without attachments. I signed up for choosing them. I met people at a pottery class in the neighborhood, and I joined a walking group that begins the day under a small, indifferent sky and ends with coffee and stories. I went to a book club where I discovered arguments about why a certain novel had the wrong number of red herrings, and I loved the absurdity of being intellectually provoked by three women who like to agree on the main points and then fight pleasantly about the margins. There are days I still feel the ghost of being looked through. Times I stand at the window and think of Robert's laugh echoing in an empty room. Or I trace with a fingertip the place on the stair riser where his initials had been carved so many years ago. But those moments are shorter now. They no longer define the weather of my life. I have learned to listen to a different kind of voice within me, one that asks, "What do I want to do next?" and then helps set a small plan in motion. If there is a lesson I would hand to someone sitting where I once sat, it is this. Grief and practicality can learn to live in the same house. You do not have to be only sorrow. You do not have to be only strategy. Allow both to be present, and let one steady the other, Use numbers when you need to. They do not somehow make you less human. And allow joy when it arrives, even if it comes as a minor thing, like a new pot that fits the stove in an exact, satisfying way. I don't pretend my story is a universal map. Markets change. Personal circumstances vary. Not everyone will find a windfall in their attic or a sympathetic neighbor with marmalade to share. But I do believe in agency, the cumulative power of small, steady acts. Choosing the house, choosing to fix it, choosing to sell it on my terms. Those were decisions that let me reclaim a narrative I had not known how to narrate without another voice intruding. People have asked me, sometimes with faces that try to be kind and curious all at once, whether I feel free now. Freedom is a large word. I feel lighter. I feel more honest. I sleep better. I find myself buying plants for the balcony and remembering their names. I find myself saying yes to invitations that used to be maybe and no to requests that were once automatic. I pick up a book in the morning and read a chapter without calculating whether the day has been well spent. That is a quiet luxury. The final flourish of all this practical work was not the bank account or the signed papers. It was a garden bench I placed on my condo balcony, cheap teak, weathered already, and a morning where I sat with a cup of coffee and no errands written down. The sun warmed the edge of the buildings across the street, and I felt a ridiculous, tear-bright gratitude for small things. The heat of the cup in my hands, the way pigeons argued about a crumb on the sidewalk, the knowledge that I had the autonomy to go or to stay. I had not been given permission to bloom. I had simply, quietly decided to. If you have stayed with me this long, thank you. Tell me where you are watching from, your city and state. Because there's comfort in knowing the human geography of who sits and listens. If you found anything in my story that feels useful, an idea about appraisal, or about choosing contractors, or about holding your own life steady, subscribe. And you'll see more like this. Long-form stories about people who had to remake ordinary things into something like new. There are no guarantees in any of this. Only choices, and sometimes the courage to make them. I am Claire, 72, the woman who watched 47 years sign away, and then learned how to sign for herself. I am not finished. I am, if anything, beginning again with a clearer map and lighter luggage.